Have you ever heard a sound that wouldn't stop, no matter how hard you tried to ignore it? A sound that seemed to follow you, growing louder, more insistent, until it drove you to the edge of madness. This is the story of the ticking clock, a tale so unsettling you might never trust the sound of time again. It all started with a man named Thomas, who thought he'd found a simple antique to decorate his home. But what he brought into his life wasn't just a clock. It was a harbinger of something dark, something that counted down to his doom. So turn off the lights, listen closely, and let's step into a nightmare that began with a tick that wouldn't stop. Thomas Reed was a 35-year-old accountant living in a quiet suburb of Boston, Massachusetts. He had a passion for history, often spending his weekends hunting for antiques to fill his modest home. On a chilly Saturday morning in December, he visited a small antique shop he'd never noticed before, tucked away on a narrow street near the edge of town. The shop was dimly lit, its shelves cluttered with dusty relics, old books, tarnished silverware, and faded paintings. The air smelled of mildew and time. Tommy wandered through the aisles, running his fingers over a cracked violin and a chipped porcelain vase, but nothing caught his interest. Then, in the back corner, he saw it. A clock. It was a tall grandfather clock, its wooden frame carved with intricate patterns of vines and flowers, its face yellowed with age. The hands were stuck at 11:58, and a faint layer of dust covered the glass. Thomas tapped the glass, half expecting it to start ticking, but it stayed silent. The shopkeeper, an old woman with a hunched back and sharp eyes, appeared behind him. "That's a special piece," she said, her voice raspy. "Been here longer than I have." Thomas smiled. "Does it work?" he asked. She shrugged. "It keeps its own time." He didn't know what she meant, but he liked the look of it. "How much?" he asked. $50, she replied. "But be careful. It doesn't like to be ignored." Thomas chuckled, thinking she was just trying to make the sale more interesting. He paid her, loaded the clock into his car, and brought it home. That night, he set it up in his living room, winding the mechanism with the old brass key that came with it. The clock sprang to life, its deep, rhythmic ticking filling the house. Thomas smiled, satisfied with his purchase. But around 2 a.m., he woke up to a sound. The ticking had changed. It was faster, sharper, almost frantic, like a heartbeat racing out of control. Thomas sat up in bed, his heart pounding in time with the clock's frantic ticks. He stumbled into the living room, the sound growing louder with every step. The clock's hands were moving now, spinning wildly, not keeping any real time. He opened the glass door and tried to stop the pendulum, but it wouldn't budge. The ticking only got faster, a relentless beat that seemed to echo inside his skull. He unplugged the clock, thinking that might stop it, but the sound continued, louder, sharper, as if it were mocking him. Finally, in frustration, he grabbed a hammer from his toolbox and smashed the clock's face. The glass shattered, the hands bent, and the ticking stopped. Thomas let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling. He swept up the pieces and threw them into the trash, hoping that would be the end of it. But the next morning he froze. The clock was back in the living room, whole and untouched, its hands pointing to 11:58 again. The ticking started as soon as he walked in, slow and deliberate, like a predator pacing. Thomas called his brother James and told him everything. James laughed it off, saying Thomas was just stressed from work. "It's a clock," he said. "It can't do anything." But Thomas wasn't so sure. That night, the ticking changed again. It wasn't just fast or slow anymore. It was uneven, erratic, like a code he couldn't decipher. And then, in the middle of the ticks, he heard something else. A whisper. "Thomas," it said, soft and cold, like a voice from a grave. He turned on every light in the house, his hand shaking as he stared at the clock. The hands were moving again, counting down from 11th. When they reached midnight, the clock let out a deep, resonant chime that shook the walls. And in that moment, Thomas saw something in the reflection of the glass. A figure, tall and shadowy, standing behind him, its eyes glowing faintly. He spun around, but there was nothing there. The ticking resumed, slow and steady, as if nothing had happened. Thomas couldn't live with it anymore. The next day, he drove back to the antique shop, the clock rattling in the trunk of his car. But the shop was gone. The building was there, but it was empty, its windows boarded up, as if it had been abandoned for years. He asked a nearby shopkeeper if he knew what happened. The man shook his head. "No one's been in that place for decades," he said. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He drove to a junkyard and left the clock there, watching as it was crushed under a pile of scrap metal. He thought that would be the end. But that night, he woke up to the sound of ticking. The clock was back in his living room, its hands pointing to 11:58. The ticking was slower now, deliberate, like a countdown. Thomas tried everything. He burned it in his backyard, the flames roaring as the wood crackled. But the next morning it was back. Unburned, he threw it into a river, watching it sink into the dark water, but it reappeared on his doorstep, dripping wet. He called James again, begging him to come over. James arrived, skeptical but worried. He saw the clock, heard the ticking, and felt the air grow cold. "This isn't normal," he said, his voice shaking. At 11:58, the hands started moving again, counting down to midnight. The ticking grew louder, faster, until it was a deafening roar. When the clock struck midnight, the chime echoed through the house, and the lights flickered. Thomas and James saw it at the same time. The shadowy figure from the reflection stepped out of the clock, its glowing eyes fixed on them. It was tall, cloaked in darkness, its face a void except for those burning eyes. "Thomas," it whispered, its voice like 1,000 ticking clocks. James screamed and ran for the door, but it wouldn't open. Thomas grabbed a chair and smashed the clock, the wood splintering, the gears flying. The figure vanished, and the ticking stopped. But the next morning, the clock was back, its hands at 11:58. James was gone. Thomas searched for him, called the police, but there was no trace. The only thing left was the clock, ticking softly, as if it were waiting. A week later, Thomas disappeared too. His house was found empty, except for the clock, its hands frozen at midnight. The clock disappeared after Thomas vanished. Some say it's still out there, sitting in an antique shop or a thrift store, waiting for its next owner. Others believe it's counting down for someone new, its ticks marking the seconds until midnight. If you ever find a grandfather clock with carved vines and a face stuck at 11:58, don't bring it home. You might hear it tick. What do you think happened to Thomas? Could you face the ticking clock? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if you're brave enough, Subscribe for more stories that'll haunt your nights. See you in the next one, if you dare.